Well, good afternoon, good morning, good day to all of you. We've got a special broadcast of Do the Work today. I've got with me Dylan Cornwell. Dylan's a good friend. He's got some expertise to share with us. If you've never seen our broadcast before, what Terry and I normally do is sit down and talk about the work of an evangelist. Our focus is really on equipping those who do this work to do it well. But at times we kind of veer into the broader picture of how the preacher integrates into the local congregation and how the two of them, congregations and evangelists, can kind of work together to do the work well. One of the areas of challenge, and I'll talk about this from my personal side to begin with, when you move into the work of preaching, is figuring out the very complicated relationships of being supported financially to do the work. And it's more than just give the guy a check after the sermon. That's actually kind of easy, but it doesn't explain all the differences, nuances, both on the federal side, the state side, the city side, and just the general relationship to his brethren. And so Dylan, in a second, he'll introduce himself, is going to talk to us about the preacher and his wages in a modern context. And so Dylan, tell everybody a little about yourself. Why are you here, besides the fact that we asked you to come and talk to us today?
All right. Well, thank you, Phil. Good morning, and good morning to those that are out there participating with us. I appreciate the invite. I am in a position, I'm a director of HR. We're a small CPA firm out of Nashville, Tennessee, and we've got employees across the country in about half the states in the country, but we're not a big company. We're small. Got a lot of nice growth going on. So I've been doing that for the last few years. And before that, I had a couple of decades where I was in the Air Force, but I had a couple of positions while in the Air Force where I was on some faculties and teaching leadership and management, some organizational behavior, HR content, and then through those years was also in a variety of different leadership and management positions with a lot of HR application, some HR policy development and things like that. So thus, the most recent experience is just doing a lot of the hiring issues and a lot of benefit administration and payroll relevant issues. I'm not the payroll person, but I work closely with the payroll team, and we analyze compensation packages when we're making offers to candidates and so forth. And so that's the context that I'm bringing to the table today. But I wanted to say thanks for the invite because this content is great. I love that you're doing a sequence. You're going to have a CPA to talk tax issues, and I think you're going to talk some other financial dimensions in the third piece of this. But most of my good close friends are preachers, and family members are preachers. My father-in-law has been a preacher for 40, 50 years. My dad actually stepped into full-time preaching here about 10 years ago after other secular work throughout his life. And most of the guys in my wedding are and have been preachers, and most of the weddings that I've been are guys that are preachers. And so anyway, through the years, I've had good exposure and done a little bit of side preaching on my own and had to report some of those details and taxes in the earlier years. And so I have a great sense and appreciation for some of the financial contrasts that preachers and their families are on the receiving end of. And so as I organized my thoughts and did a little bit of particular research for today, I'm really thinking of this presentation with two audiences in mind. I'm thinking in terms of those that may be considering getting into preaching, who may be younger, maybe they're still in school, maybe they're doing some preaching on the side and they're looking forward to preaching full time if that opportunity is there for them, but they haven't necessarily considered some of the financial contrasts. And that's not to advocate anything. That's just to inform, hey, if you receive an offer, if a congregation comes in and says, we'd like to bring you on board and this is what we would like to offer you, then to kind of have some level of awareness in the back of your mind of what does that offer really mean in the context of some other things that I may consider as I look to take care of my family. So that's part. And the actual broader audience are brethren who I think probably often just don't consider the financial aspects of preaching. Now, in fairness, preachers don't preach ultimately for the money. They're driven. They want to do the Lord's work in that way. And they're willing often to accept some of those financial challenges that don't necessarily confront most folks in the secular working world. But at the same time, they've got important responsibilities to their family. They've got important things that they would like to be able to do to help and support with some of their income and pursue some other things that are that are very, very important. And so a lot of brethren just don't necessarily think about the income dimension of preaching, probably just because they haven't given it thought. And so if you've got a good group of elders that are really in tune with that, and you've got deacons or whoever may be working the finances within the congregation, hopefully they are leaning forward to think harder about what this really means for the preacher, and to ensure that that congregation is doing everything that they can to support that preacher in the right way. But oftentimes, I think brethren don't give it the deeper consideration that they should. And so I kind of have that in mind to kind of show to those brethren that may not have given it that level of thought, hey, here's how the numbers basically can really shake out, and here's some of that contrast. So that's way too long, Phillip. You can see I can speak way too much.
Well,
so
normally Terry's here, and so you've got twice the ego on the other end of the conversation with Terry, so I think we'll have a lot more space in the conversation. What we're going to do well today is break down what I think is one of the most obvious myths involving the preacher and his wages. And I see this a lot in conversation with young preachers. I know I experienced it as a younger preacher. I know I still deal with it at times as a slightly graying or more gray-haired preacher. I'm only gray like halfway, so I'm young up here and old down here. And that is that you can make some level of dollar-to-dollar comparison, that if the preacher's budget space is $75,000 on our ledger, then that means it's the same as any member of the congregation, and so their take-home is $75,000, or even their gross is $75,000. Their pre-tax income is $75,000. And then there's the same details, same across the board, dollar for dollar comparison. And really, no matter which you take, net or gross, you're still not doing an accurate comparison of the compensation package that's put in place, not merely to retain an employee at a business, but to sustain their productive service and help them grow to be a better employee in the future, a better servant. I think there's probably some connections to it as well, is that we see our world as a capitalist society, but in reality, most businesses I know really are highly focused on building and maintaining a good relationship with their workforce. They don't want to change employees every 6 years. They don't want to be having to constantly churn through an employee group, because that actually makes it harder for them to be successful. They don't want to train a new guy. They want to take the old guy and make him better. And so I think there's some confusion, mainly because I've been properly informed of how things are versus how things were. And I'll say one caveat, and Dylan can talk to this too. Things have gotten tremendously better in the last two generations of preachers in regards to the way that brethren build relationships economically with preachers. My wife's grandfather preached in an era where it was almost expected that you might only be at a congregation for 2 to 3 years, and you were going to move your family every 2 to 3 years. He was part of the end of a generation like that, where preachers were just kind of accessories. Terry and I have talked extensively that the preacher should be a holistic part of your brethren. They are your brother or sister in Christ. You need to build a relationship with them. The shepherds need to engender or build that culture that says, you're one of us, not over there. You belong with us. And so there's not one edge of what Bill and I are talking about that is negative, accusatory, everything's bad. It's let's make informed decisions so that we are supporting the work of saving souls in a healthy way, and alleviate, particularly for younger guys, some of the stress that comes early on in preaching. And so that's where I'm coming from, and that our audience kind of spans a lot of that. We've got a big spectrum of folks who have different backgrounds too. Dylan, let's get to the heart of it. I know you put some stuff together, and let's break down some of these details. I'll add this. For those of you who are watching live or afterwards, go ahead and leave questions. I'll probably see them first, and I can relay them right to Dylan, and we can talk about it. But Dylan's got a slide that we're going to start with, and you can probably bring it over now, Dylan, kind of break it down, or if you want to introduce some stuff first too, that's good as well.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start sharing this slide. And this slide is purposely very simple. And again, the intention, for those of you that have been preaching for some time, you get this just by virtue of your experience and because you filed your taxes and you're living it. But I put this together in mind, one, to kind of walk through what are the big core benefit areas to think about in addition to the actual earned income. And we'll talk, not trying to get terribly deep, but just to expose you to some of the ratios and some of the norms that are out there in the private sector, so you can bring that into your consideration as it relates to the work that you do as a preacher and what the parallels might be on a financial basis. But really to walk through and show the contrast for the benefit of a brother in the congregation who may see that line item. It's a great way to describe it, Bill. May see the line item on a congregational budget that shows here's the annual income that we anticipate paying our preacher, and then thinks of that in terms of their own experience and what they're earning on the job, and then probably thinks, okay, I get it, and then moves on and doesn't give it more thought. And when you look at what companies are able to do in the private sector and some of the regulatory requirements that are imposed from different tax authorities, a variety of levels, you really end up with some contrast. So I've just put this single slide together. There's a lot of variation. These are notional starting points, but some pretty realistic general ratios, some averages and some norms in there, just to give you a sense, and to use it as well to talk through some of these different benefit categories. So what I've got is on the left side, you're going to see, let's say for the sake of discussion, that you've got a person, maybe it's me, I'm working at a company, a local company, whatever the industry, doesn't matter, and I'm earning $75,000 in compensation. The offer that they give me is going to be a $75,000 offer, or at the end of the year, when I look at the gross compensation on my W-2, it's going to say $75,000. And I'll tell you why at first I went with $75,000, because even that, there's a lot of latitude, obviously, in what preachers may be earning, a lot of latitude in the private sector. The median household income here is, according to census data, right now about $60,000 a year. The average household income is about $90,000. So depending on how you calculate the average, that median, that means about half of families in America are earning $60,000 or more, and about half are earning $60,000 or less. But the real average, because of the influence of higher income earners, the average household is bringing home about $90,000. Well, not bringing home, but they're starting with about $90,000. So I just kind of split it right there in the middle between 60 and 90 and went with $75,000. So let's say for the sake of discussion, you've got a $75,000 salary and you're working for that company in town. And we tend to think of the benefits as the big three and then a variety of other possibilities. And your big three normally are going to be medical insurance, a 401k plan, some sort of a retirement plan, and there's a lot of variation out there, but the dominant form for most companies is going to be the 401k, and then your paid time off and how much time are you going to be. We're not going to get into the paid time off piece, but we are going to take a look at the health plan, which is the biggest cost factor and the biggest contrast between somebody working for a company that's able to offer a health plan and a preacher and their family that might like the equivalent type of care available to their family. And then we'll talk about the implications of the 401k. And then we'll also talk about some of the Social Security and Medicare, the FICA tax contrast, and then wrap it up. So let's start with that health plan, that first sub-bullet. So you're starting out with $75,000. And a good rule of thumb on average, when you look at companies across, and we do a lot of benchmark studies, when you look at what companies offer across the country, in general, for a family coverage, let's envision a husband and wife, maybe it's a husband who's working and a wife that's staying home, and a couple of children, that family coverage is typically costing through a group health plan that the company is going to arrange with a private insurance carrier. And a lot of variation. It depends on the size of the deductibles and the size of the out-of-pocket maxes and the size of copays and whether it's going to qualify for a health savings account. A lot of different latitude. But in general, when you're looking at the norms, kind of right in the middle, that plan's probably costing that family about $18,000, maybe $20,000. And the average across all sizes of companies and all industries across the nation Your typical company is going to spend about 75% of the company is going to pay for about 3/4 of the cost of that premium. And the employee is going to spend about 1/4 of the cost of that premium. And so the employee is going to have some premium withheld from every paycheck typically. Now, there are some companies, and the bigger the companies are, the better shot you have. There are some companies that are able to pay all of your health insurance premiums. That's fantastic. It's less than 10% of companies in the United States that are able to do that. And on the other end, it tends to be when you have smaller companies, say a company with 50 or less people, that average, the company's probably spending about 50% of those health plan premiums, and the employee is covering the other 50%. But they're able to qualify for some group health plan coverage. There's some negotiation that takes place with those carriers, and they can compete different quotes. And so you end up with, you put all that together, typically a family coverage plan is costing what the insurance carrier is going to receive. This is before any coverage, before any actual out-of-pocket cost, just for the premiums, somewhere in the $18,000 to $20,000 price range. So let's say then that you're working for an average company. That average company is going to be paying about 75% of those premiums. And there's also variation on, normally a lot of companies are going to pay more for the employee, him or herself, and a little bit less than the family member. But if you shake it all out, let's say for the sake of discussion, about 75%. Well, that means the employee's out-of-pocket cost for that premium is going to be about $4,500. So you start with $75,000. You take away $4,500. Now let's move on to the 401k. 75% of all companies in the United States, as you know, pension plans are a tremendous rarity anymore. Government positions still offer them in many cases, but in the private sector, it's much, much less frequent than it was in generations past. And the norm that has replaced that is a 401k, where you get to invest. The company normally arranges with kind of a mutual fund company. You think of companies like Fidelity or Vanguard or Charles Schwab or T. Rowe Price, and they're going to offer a variety of mutual funds that are managed, and the employee is going to contribute some small portion of their income into that, and the company commits to matching some portion of what the employee is going to put in. And again, a lot of variation, but a very common model would be if the employee chooses to contribute, the most common model is if they contribute about 6% of their personal income, then the company is going to pitch in 3% on top of that. So for a total of 9% going into those mutual funds. And the idea is those are going to grow over time. And then once you hit retirement age at about 65, then you can begin to take those out, just like you might choose to do some private investing if you have the ability to do that. But the benefit there is that the company is providing that match. If it's a 6% from the employee and 3% from the company, that's a 50% instant gain for that employee. Another common model is for if an employee wants to put in 5%, then, and there's regulations that influence this model, but then the company might put in 4%, again, for a total of 9% invested. So I went with a 3% model. And let's say that the employee, in order to get a match, a one-for-one match, let's say that this plan has the employee put in 3%, the company's going to put in 3%, which is, or excuse me, 6%, and that's the average, by the way, that a company is going to put in. Well, then that employee is going to take out $2,250 to get that $6,750 in retirement through the course of that year. And then the third big contrast effect is FICA taxes, which is predominantly Social Security and also Medicare. And those numbers shake out. That's a total of about 15.3% between those two. And so when you're working in the private sector, your employer is obligated to pay half of that, and the employee is paying half of that. So the sum of that is going to be, in this case, a little bit over $11,000. But the employee is only paying out of pocket just under $6,000 of that. And so when you take away those big costs, you end up with taking home, and this is before the possibility of dental plans or vision plans or disability plans or maybe some term life insurance plans, some other ancillary benefits that for the most part end up being entirely out of the employee's pocket. Some companies will cover some portion of that or even all. A lot of variation across those smaller benefits. But let's set those aside for the moment. They end up with about $62,500. Well, now let's contrast that with that preacher. Preacher may be starting out with that same starting salary of $75,000. But if they want that equivalent health plan for their family, then that's going to be entirely out of their pocket. And now that's $18,000. And you can see that's a contrast of $13,500 right there. And so what really ends up happening more often is preachers either forego health insurance, which is not too unusual. They look for, now with what the government has been doing over the last several years, they look for opportunities to plug into the local market. There may be subsidies available that they're able to plug into to decrease some of those costs. Or more often, they're going to get a health plan that is less than the level of coverage they'd really prefer. It might be closer to a catastrophic only plan. They're going to pay a lot more out-of-pocket costs as a result. They may not have negotiated network costs. Or, again, they may just choose to accept the risk and go entirely out of pocket. So, but let's say that they want to keep up and have that health plan. So to do that, they're going to be paying $18,000. And if they're trying to think ahead and be financially prepared in those later years, and they want to have that equivalent, then to get that equivalent in $6,750 in retirement, they don't have the match. They don't have the benefit of that. And so they're going to put in $6,750 in order to get that. And then they're going to be responsible for, now what tends to happen there is, because that's a high price point, they end up typically not investing or investing at a much, much lower rate. And therefore, over the course of decades, they're going to be battling to find out how to make sure that they can take care of their financial needs in those later years. So it tends to happen. But let's say that they do their best to keep up and they spend that just under $7,000. And Phillip, I know I'm getting wordy here, so I'm going to try to expedite here. And then they are 100% responsible for all their Social Security and Medicare costs. That's a full 15.3%. So they're paying all 11.4 thousand out of that. And you run those numbers, and that takes you down to 39,000. And what sometimes preachers will choose to do, because that's a huge hit for the Social Security and Medicare, is they'll choose to opt out of Social Security. And I've had conversations with preachers that have and have not. And I really recommend, unless you're in dire circumstances, though I'm not a big proponent of Social Security per se, but stay in there if you can, do so. I've talked with preachers that in their earlier years received conflicting advice, and now they're in those ages in their 60s and 70s, and they stuck with it, and they're glad that they did. And I've talked with others who gave it up, and they wish that they had been able to stick with it. Because in those later years, in those 60s and those years of your 60s and 70s, whatever is happening in the future with Social Security, at least there is that portion that is there. And so let's say that this preacher chooses to stick with Social Security. The bottom line, $39,000. That difference between the two, while initially it looks like it's the same earnings, the real difference is over $23,000. And that's before income taxes, and that's before you've ever gone to the grocery store to buy that first bag of groceries. So this is what I think a lot of brethren just don't give consideration to, let alone the smaller things. Within a job in the private sector, you've got some advocacy. If things just aren't going right, or you feel like you need to have a relook at some measure of your compensation, you usually have an HR department that you can go to. You may have a supervisor that you can sit down and have some good conversations with. You can talk about some long-term goals, things like that, or potentially if you're mistreated or you want to negotiate some variation on these benefits, you've got those tools and that reach out. It's a little bit challenging for a preacher to do that. There may not be elders and all the other challenges therein. So go ahead, Phil.
Let me insert in here. We're going to get into a couple of things. One quick question. Alex Hale asked about self-employment tax. SE tax is the combination of Social Security and Medicare. So that 15.3%, when your accountant talks about it, that's exactly that line item there. So Alex, the 15.3 is the SE tax. That's how it gets accounted for on your forms. And by the way, Alex, next week is when you really want to pay attention. Brandon LeConte will be with us talking specifically about the preacher and his taxes. He's a subject matter expert there, and so he'll be next week for that. But we can talk about some of this. So I wanted to interject this. I think there's an important thing to think about beyond the obvious math. The obvious math is that there is no dollar for dollar comparison on the budget line. It just doesn't exist. But we're not thinking about the unintended consequences of even just these three choices. And there's other things that we'll talk about toward the end of our time in the HR department realm that are really important that elders can take the responsibility of. So number one, if your evangelist, if your preacher decides to not take advantage of a healthcare plan, what that does is it means he's trading his sense of security and his spouse's sense of security and his children's sense of security in order to retain income that he might need for another part of his life. Well, everyone gets sick. And when the preacher gets sick, it's just like anybody else. And I want to think on a practical level. Your preacher gets really sick. What's going to happen at that context? What's the outcome for him? Well, maybe he gets better and everything goes well and all that's just fine. But now he's not been able to preach for 2, 3, 4 months. The typical brethren response should be, he's family, we've taken care of them. But the opposite outcome tends to take place, where, well, yeah, he's sick, and when he gets well, maybe he'll move, or we haven't seen him in so long, we're disconnected. It creates a barrier in the relationship that was never the intended part of that. And so keeping that laborer healthy actually improves the relationship, and that's not thought about when you're looking at the money. There's other aspects of that too. The biblical relationship of husband and wife is in part that the wife is the helpmeet to the husband. The elder as an evangelist, as a friend. If mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And if mama's always concerned about someone getting sick, and they usually tend to be the caregiver at home, then that becomes the cycle of the home. The same thing is true in the next two areas. I know many men who, as they get to the gray areas of their preaching, they get in their 70s, they get in their 80s, they are legitimately less effective than they would like to be. They can't remember. It takes them longer to prepare. The health issues start stacking up. They preach themselves to death in the pulpit. It's not good for them. But from a congregation standpoint, it's not good for the church either. Because you have churches then who are receiving that teaching at the end of the sponge's life, and he's trying to squeeze every ounce of himself out because he hasn't been able to make those preparations to shift his role. How much better with a semi-retired preacher along with a younger preacher in the same congregational context, where now you have two minds able to share the task and two hearts able to lean on each other. And one of them is bringing with him the 20, 40, 60 years worth of evangelistic experience he's had to go hand in hand with the Timothy in the same congregational context. And you've planned for it rather than squeezed or shoehorned it in. These are things that actually benefit the congregation. I think that's one of the things that's really important, that this is not about merely making sure you're doing your best for the one guy. What you're ended up doing is making the best spiritual environment for the flock, particularly those who are shepherds. This is how you get good teaching. You get it by retaining it. Is to do that work and to get the best people into it.
Bill, you're making a great point. I'd like to chime in, especially relevant to that health plan. What you remarked made me think of something. I'm going to take this slide off so we can just talk here a little bit. But for elders, for deacons, for brethren, it is worth putting your mind around. So many of us have been working in the private sector, otherwise just had normal or traditional employment through the years, that we take the presence of that health insurance often for granted. And when a family does not have health insurance, that can be a remarkable source of natural tension and difficulty and challenge within a family. And to kind of describe that further, have a conversation with your wife. For those who have never been preachers or who've never been full-time supported preachers, have a conversation with your wife. If you've always had health insurance, for the most part, in one form or another, and just ask, how would you feel if we didn't have health insurance? Or if we had just a very minimal amount of health insurance that probably didn't? And there is a source of security that comes from having that plan in place that is very, very appreciated by many, many spouses. And I personally didn't appreciate that until I'd been married for probably 5, 6, 7 years, and actually having a conversation with my wife, and we had a good health plan in place at the time, but we were pondering whether we wanted to continue down that path or step into some other different type of work. And my wife made a comment. She said, I just really value, and she grew up in a family, her dad is a preacher, where the health insurance wasn't always there. And she said, I just really value having health insurance. And I, as the husband, had never considered how important that was to my wife. And then I've seen in other circumstances where when that health insurance isn't there, it can be a real constraint. And you talk about real financial considerations, and you don't have that plan in place. It inherently creates doubt, even if everybody's healthy. It inherently creates doubt. What if something unexpected does take place and the costs involved? So for congregations that financially are in a position to do so and may not be doing much regarding providing additional income or directly acquiring a health insurance plan for their preacher, if you've got the financial ability to do that and you're not, you need to look at that hard, because that's a great source of security within the family. It can make a big difference as it relates to the preaching. That's your point.
Yeah, I think it's about a healthy relationship between the congregation and the servants within it. We're not even dealing with the doctrinal theological questions of, is the preacher someone who should, that we've set that off the table. I think that's an easy discussion, but that's not what we're talking about. Once you've made that decision to hire, bring in a wage earner, whatever term you want to use, I'm comfortable with all of them. Now you're obligated to think through the process. And we'll say this again next week too. If your whole perspective about supporting the evangelist financially is to give him a 1099 and a check each week, I think you've missed the balanced and biblical model that you could have. And you're kind of creating unplanned problems. I firmly believe that there's no negative intention for the most part with brethren in these areas. It's a high level of inexperience, a high level of shift culturally. The way we compensate employees in America has changed dramatically over the last 40 years. The way people work in those environments over the years. And it's really important to still be culturally sensitive to what works in our given locality. What Dill and I are talking about are generalizations for the general situation. But if you're laboring in the Tech Valley of Bay Area, your situation is going to have some different numbers. The ratios are probably going to be the same, but your numbers are going to be different. If you're in, I don't know, Burns, Tennessee, a small community in Burns, you're going to have a different numbers to work through, but the ratios are going to be the same. Have open conversations. One other thing we didn't talk about, and I think it's important to include in this dialogue, is that the concept of adjustment because of inflation has to be considered. We're not talking about merit raises, although our culture includes a concept of merit-based raises based on experience. We'll set that off the table. There's some value to it. But bottom line, when I was a kid, and this is the way they illustrate it, to go fill up my 68 Mustang, I'd go purchase leaded gasoline, and you're paying, I think it was 73 cents a gallon at the Shell station. It doesn't cost 73 cents a gallon at the Shell station anymore. So there's that inflation aspect that has taken place in our entire culture. And so that has to be factored in on an annual basis. However you want to approach it, as long as you're approaching the discussion and making intentional decisions, you're including the basic principle of profiting the heart of the one who works so that they don't have to be stressed in their work. And you see that a lot with Paul. Paul is one of the texts I brought up in the context of what we're thinking about here. And Paul shifts from he's making tents to make ends meet, and he does so because that's what he needs to do, to fully devoting himself to the work, and instantly he's able to enthusiastically engage in spiritual conversations and dialogues because he's no longer worrying about where his next meal is going to come from. And so I think that's a part of this picture that has to be kind of included too when we're thinking about the terms we use and why these things are relevant and important. Particularly to the young preachers, I want to say that to you guys, whenever you go discuss a work with some congregation, talk about it. Talk about these financial matters early on rather than 2 or 3 years down the road. Ask good questions. And if you don't know the answer, um, then find someone who does. Justin Robertson has a question. I'll read it to you. And we may talk about the advantage of a local church paying your insurance premium for you versus a local church paying you $10.99 yearly and you paying the health insurance premium yourself. Justin, I just read your question. We'll definitely deal with that next week. That's more of a tax-specific situation. I will tell you this briefly. It's my particular understanding, and I know that Brandon, who is a professional, Brandon is this is not Dylan, Brandon's our next week, will tell you that you probably should be getting a W-2, which doesn't necessarily impact who pays what on the ledger, but we'll talk about that in depth. But Dylan, did you have anything from your experience on the HR side that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'll give a quick answer. If the congregation is willing and able to pay entirely for the premiums on that, then, and I think you're going to find the tax implications make it, that, in my view, would be the better way to go. Let them secure the contract, work with the broker, and they pay those premiums, because if you're paying them out of pocket, you're not able to deduct all of those medical costs. I think there's a 10% of your adjusted gross income before you can start deducting your medical costs that include the premiums. And so the trade-off is not one for one. So you're better off financially. You end up with some additional money to work with within your budget if the congregation is going to pay for it outright. Now, there's trade-offs to that as well. If you did it entirely on your own, on the local market, then the contract is between you and the carrier. And if something unexpected were to happen with the congregation, you would still have that health insurance in place. Now, if something unexpected happened with the congregation, you still have the cost of that health insurance. If the congregation carries that policy, that may actually free you. So there's contrast between the two, and part of it is financial. So
one other thing, though, there are very specific rules that are now in place for wages, teachers, pastors, however terminology we want to use, in the reporting side. And I'll just say this. If you've heard anything about what you can and cannot deduct off of your taxes as a preacher that did not come out of the mouth of a CPA who was willing to sign his name on the audit form, maybe you want to double check. It may be right. And the advice that Dylan and I are giving is given with that same caveat. We're not signing your taxes. So I highly encourage working with competent professionals in the area. Alex has a question that kind of goes up the age scale a little bit. He says, what about us guys that are a little older? And when we first moved to a church, we didn't know to have these conversations. How do we have them once we've been here for a while? That's an excellent question. Dylan, I'll let you go second because I'm going to drop a couple things from experience.
Yeah.
And then nuances too. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is actually have the conversation. And he said, well, what do you mean by that? I said, figure out in your list of things that you want to talk about, which is the right now conversation you need to have. And do all your research. Figure out, like, why is this important? What is the math involved? How does this impact the local church? How will this make the congregation healthier and grow stronger? And actually talk to them about it, giving them some good information. Also, if you have shepherds, it's going to be easier, but that's not always the case. It's uncomfortable no matter what. You're probably already accustomed to the reality that your wage of everybody else's wages is posted on the back of the building. That's not going to change anytime soon. I might want it helped a different way, but you got to start having that conversation, and you kind of pick. Okay, the one that I encourage at the top of the list is probably a cost of living adjustment. The reason I say that is that almost everybody works in a context where their wages are increased annually. If they're on fixed incomes, they get a COA. If they work at a place of typical employment, they get a merit raise or a time in service raise. And approach that one first. Also point out that you may be able to help them in the future save money by some of these choices. Some proper financial management reduces liability to the local church and liability to the local evangelist. And so by getting competent instruction, the conversation might actually help them make better fiscal choices for their future. As an example, most churches should never have owned financially, purely on financials, parsonages. They don't work the way people want them to work. They don't retain structures. They actually do not get maintained well as a rental, if you will, because that's how they get treated. And so they're a drain on the resources of a local church without the return they're looking for, guys wanting to stay with them and work with them. So talking about it is really the only thing. Just pick one and then go gentle with it. Accept that it might take 6 months to get to a healthier conversation. And also know this, you can have all these conversations you want, but if the money's not there in their budget, then there's nothing they can do about it, but you may just be asking for the leeway to reach out larger. It shouldn't be that way, but brethren kind of feel like they should have a say in whether or not you get outside support. I disagree with it to a certain degree, but that would probably be my approach. Start with cost of living, talk about it, and then get some advice from some of those members. Maybe they know things you don't know. It's kind of like going to desk at customer service. If you go there telling to get one option, which is go away, if you go there asking them how to solve this problem, you might get some better options. You may not like the outcome either. I'll tell a story in a second, but Dylan, what's your short answer to that longer question?
Yeah. So the challenge of that, of pursuing what is essentially a raise, that exists in the private sector as well, and it's always difficult. It's challenging for all parties that are involved. And so as far as technique goes, one, lay the groundwork. Don't bring everything up cold and be ready to have it at that first conversation. Explain to those that are going to be your target audience, be it elders in a congregation, or if you don't have elders, if it's going to be the men at a men's meeting, lay the groundwork. That's just a technique that I recommend, of saying, I'd like in a few weeks or maybe at next month's meeting to bring this topic up if we can add it to the agenda so that we can talk about it. And then do your homework and show, here's what I've been earning. Here's how our family dynamics are changing. The family is growing. Our costs are increasing. Here's what's happening with our health insurance premiums, or we've not been able to afford health insurance and we'd really like to get to the point that we do that. And here are the quotes that I've gotten from some of the plans available to me locally through a broker. Do all that homework in advance. It's much easier to receive when you see the real dollar implications, and much easier to get the head to nod up and down and say, yes, I get that. And the other thing, just for those brethren that may have that budget posted on the back, if you've got your preacher's income line itemed on there, and I've seen that, I understand that happens, but put yourself in the shoes of that preacher and treat that preacher the way that you would want to be treated if you were in their shoes. Would you want your weekly pay statement to be posted back there where the public could see it? Nobody feels comfortable with that. And so if you can take that off of that bulletin board, do that, because it's going to just feel a little bit better for that preacher and their family.
Yeah. A couple other things that you could consider doing in that process. That you can have the groundwork. You can go and ask for help on this matter, and you're going to get all kinds of weird answers. I remember I did a similar thing, and I was saying, look, I'm about to get married. This is how our finances will change. And people looked at my finances. They were saying, well, here's our advice. And they say, well, look, you've got this 403B contribution you're making every month. Just cut that out and you'll be fine. And so you're going to get some weird responses. Don't respond negatively to someone who may not have thought it through when they speak. Just relax. It's going to be okay. There's usually someone in the group that's going to answer a weird way. And there's usually someone who's going to go, wait a minute, we don't want to do it that way. It's going to be okay if you just exude some patience. Nothing always works perfectly, but incrementally, again, prioritize. And if you have elders, it's a lot easier. Realize not just because someone is really good at shepherding souls, they may not personally understand the financial marketplace. That's totally okay. And in fact, there's probably some advantages to having the preacher pay side skipped off of the elders table and let the deacons potentially handle it. Maybe they're better suited for that task. I remember as a kind of way to think about it, one of the congregations near us, it's a sizable group. They were trying to determine what they were going to use as a model for the support of their local evangelist. And so the elders got the deacons together and said, "Here's blank pieces of paper." Um, and with all of that, the blank piece of paper says, "Put down your wages. Don't leave your name, just your number." And they average the deacons what they could set the benchmark for what they were looking at as the evangelist's expectation, because they kind of expected the evangelist to be in the same age bracket as their deacons. Not a hard line, but certainly something that would be in the same realm. And so that was kind of really in the same context there. So, in all of this, we've got some good principles to look forward to in the sense of now we have a good idea of what the numbers look like. Now we have an idea on some levels of what we're dealing with, with the evangelist number, wages and all that. And I want to highlight one thing. I was thinking about Dylan's chart, and we'll talk about this next week. We were working with raw numbers. There's a couple of things that you can do with the way you do your parsonage allowance that can help SE tax, because different wages get taxed at different points in that process. And so realize that number is just an average thrown out there, comparative number. Everybody's situation is going to be different. And so there's some things that we can do there in that context that we'll certainly look at. Scrolling back through my notes, I think we've covered everything that I had in mind. Dylan, was there something else that you wanted to bring up for us before we close out for today?
I think we've covered a lot. This could be a full one-day session. There's so much detail, and there can be complexity all the way down to a local level. But hopefully this gives a good overview for folks to chew on if they haven't otherwise given it that level of thought.
So let me do this. We normally always do this at the close of our broadcast. We let folks who may have other projects or things that they're super passionate about plug those things. We also tell people if they know they can do that. So for Dylan, since he doesn't have a Facebook page, if you want to get a hold of Dylan, just do the work a message and we'll pass it on to him. We'll serve as the conduit through Facebook for him. That way he won't have to worry about being on Facebook.
There's some joy in not being on Facebook, I will just say.
We miss you there. It'd be more fun with you in the soup rather than outside the soup. There's some interesting extra joiners into our live broadcast. I feel like they're making some level of a joke that I'm not understanding. Something talking about a couch auction or something like that. I feel like that has something to do with you because it certainly doesn't have anything to do with me. But who knows?
They may be commenting on the chair, or they may just really like the headset that I'm working with, which you can get for about $20 off of Amazon. With a roll of duct tape, it works fantastically. So.
Yeah. We'll we got Ric Flair and others coming in. It's interesting. We've hit some strange corner of the interweb, and we've found our way into 4chan. It's possible. It's possible. But with all that said, Dylan, thanks for joining us and taking some time in your busy schedule to talk to us about this edge of the preacher's work. Next week, we'll certainly be getting together with Brandon LeConte. Terry will be back with us. Terry, by the way, had some schedule issues. That's why he wasn't with us today. I've tried to stay as quiet as I can, but my voice is starting to reach the end of its useful time phrase as well. But thanks again, everybody. Have a great day. May the Lord bless you guys in your work.